And there was a group of nuns who lived down the road. And one of the young nuns decided she really liked Ajahn Fuang. And so he'd see these special little foods in his bowl in the morning, or she would knit little things for his spoon and his fork. And so Ajahn Mun was watching what was going on. And so he noticed that Ajahn Fuang wasn't interested, so he decided to turn his attention on the nun. And so there's one day when the nuns came for instructions, and he asked them if they were observing their 8 precepts, and they said yes. And he said, he told them the story about Lady Visakha, who was visiting a group of people observing the 8 precepts, and they were sort of in different groups. And so she went from group to group to group to ask them, why are you practicing the 8 precepts? She got this group of old people, and they said, we're getting old in our lives now, and we're thinking about what's going to happen after death, and so we decided we want to go to heaven. So we're practicing the 8 precepts. So she goes from group to group and finally gets to a group of young women and asks them, and said, we want something better than heaven. We want a husband. And Ajahn Fuang said, the special food disappeared, the knitted stuff disappeared. That was the end of it. So that's an example of Ajahn Mun's humor. And you read in the various Ajahns. Ajahn Chah is famous for his humor. I'd recommend that you also look at Ajahn Lee's Dharma talks. He's got some really great passages. He's got that story about the slave who's jealous of the dog. Do you know that one? This poor slave is working at this one family, and they've invited this private Buddha to come in every day for the meal. And the slave's duty is to carry the private Buddha's bowl and bag up to the door of the house. He's not allowed in the house. And then when the private Buddha comes out, he'll take his bowl and his bag, and they'll take him out to the outer gate. And one day he's allowed in the house. And as he's going in, he sees this dog who's eating rice and fine curries off of a silver dish. And he goes back and he tells his wife, and we get only the worst rice in the house. You have to pound the rice every day. I have to go out and I have to cut the wood for this. That we would have been better off if we'd been born as dogs, like that dog. And so the next couple of days he follows the monk in and out of the house, and then there's one day when he has a heart attack and dies. And so his spirit is hanging around the house. So he sees the monk going in, he goes in with the monk. And there was one day when the monk was invited in, and he was given lots of gifts from the couple who were in the house. And so on the way out, he's carrying the gifts out. The dog sees this and starts barking at him, thinking that he's stolen something. And the spirit of the slave goes into the dog, into his mouth, and then it gets stuck. He can't get out. And so there he is in the dog. And so they notice that the dog is starting to misbehave, and he can't stay in any place, and it's sleeping in places it shouldn't, and it's doing things it shouldn't in the house. So they put it downstairs with the other dogs, and pretty soon it mates with a female dog, and then this spirit of the slave gets reborn in the puppy. Now, can you imagine a Dharma talk? You're sitting there meditating, you're hearing this. And so Ajahn Lee goes on about the poor the spirit inside the dog. And so then finally he gets born. And because he's been running around inside the mother, as soon as he gets born, his eyes are wide open, he can run around. And he sees the private Buddha, and he goes up to him, and he grabs his bag, and he's just so happy to see them. And the couple who run the house, they really feel a lot of affection for the little puppy, because he's just such an enthusiastic supporter of this private Buddha. And so he's allowed in the house. And then the next day it so happens that this is the last day that the private Buddha is going to be invited into the house. And so he turns to the couple and says goodbye to them. And he turns to the dog and he says, okay, this is going to be my last year here. I don't want you following me back to the forest. I have to go back to the forest now. And so the dog dies of a broken heart. And then the next thing you know is he's a deva up in heaven. And so the moral of the story is, when you're meditating, don't go chasing after dogs. Ajahn Fuang says that back when Ajahn Lee was alive, that they'd have these all-night sits, and they'd have one monk giving a Dharma talk at every hour of the night. And Ajahn Lee would wait for the 3 a.m. shift, because he knew that was the point where people were really falling asleep. And he'd tell something like this, and that would get them kind of over the 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. hump. And so what I'm saying here is that this quality of dispassion is not just kind of a dead lifeless, I don't care about life anymore. It's more of stepping back, and this is what we have the practices for. It's learning how to step back from our concerns, our ordinary concerns, our ordinary defilements, basically, and realizing this is really dumb. Why am I following this? And you can learn how to disidentify through humor. It's one of the most effective ways of cutting through a lot of the problems of the mind. So these are some of the ways in which you take what you've learned. In other words, these various frameworks, the Four Noble Truths, the five aggregates, the six sense spheres, and whatnot. Learn to use them as a framework for looking at your life. And then you can figure out, okay, what's the skillful thing to do in any particular situation? And it's good to have good frameworks. This is why we study the Dharma. So it gives us particular advice on what's going to be the skillful thing to do in this particular situation. So it's not irrelevant to the practice. We're not here just being barely aware, and we're not here just getting in touch with some innate quality of the mind. We're actually training ourselves and learning how to look at ourselves more skillfully so we can step back from our unskillful habits, recognize them as stuff and as such, and then learn how to let them go. And so this is why we study. And so if you're studying and you find yourself getting involved in a lot of Abhidhamma technicalities, you may say, well, this is getting off the track a bit. But if you find yourself reading in terms of, okay, how does this apply to the Four Noble Truths? How does this apply to the way I'm making myself suffering? What lessons do I learn here that I can apply? Okay, then that kind of study is actually going to be helpful for the practice. So that was basically what I have to say for tonight. We go right into the questions. Does anyone want to stand up for a minute before we? Okay. Okay. Now, do we have a traveling mic, or how do we do this? Let's sit. Okay. I didn't see the button. Okay, fine. Okay. Any questions?
I've certainly found reading books, I've read quite a few, written by contemporary writers on the Dharma, and listening to Dharma talks, very useful. I have found it difficult, I have really not gotten into reading the Buddha's words because I find his words in the old texts so difficult to relate to, the language, the concepts, the era they were written in. I just find myself kind of put off or puzzled or just find it hard to relate to. So,
okay, one thing you might want to look at is, have you ever checked the study guides on Access to Insight, where they have different short passages that are related to a particular topic, and there's kind of a progressive approach to each particular topic, and that can get you kind of into the language and into the thought world of the time. I mean, one of the problems with the suttas is the way they're arranged. They're arranged in such a way that it was easy to memorize, but without much interest in sort of making it easy to comprehend. And so they don't start from sort of basics and working their way up. It's more, this particular sutta. Although one of the interesting things about the way they're organized, both in the Majjhima and in the Digha Nikaya, is in the very first sutta, the Buddha will talk about what the Dharma is not. So he points out a long list of wrong views. And it's good to have that kind of background, because that's one way of clearing the air. About, okay, he's not talking about this, he's not talking about that, he's not making this assumption or that assumption. He's focused on I mean, what was really radical for him, and on the one hand, it is important to see him in the context of his time, and in other ways, it's important to see that he was not typical of his time. I mean, he starts out by saying he was looking for the deathless, which was an old concept throughout Indian thought, that you want to find something that doesn't die. The question was, how do you find that? And it was his insight. He says, you look at the way the mind is causing itself suffering. And that was his instinct. That was his basically insight. And so he's focused on the issue of, okay, what is suffering? Why is it caused? How can you put an end to it? And there were lots of other issues that were floating around at the time. Is the self the same is your soul the same as your body? Is it different from your body? Is the world eternal? Is it not eternal? Is it finite or is it infinite? He basically said, I'm not interested in answering those questions. So it's important to see the things that he put aside and said no to. Probably for the rest of this evening, when people ask what would be a good book to read, I'm going to recommend one of mine. In this particular case, there's a book called Skill and Questions, which talks about how the Buddha would approach a question, which questions he thought were worth answering, which ones were not. And then he had basically a schema for which questions to answer, basically yes, no, which questions you had to rephrase the question before he would answer it, which questions he said that first you question the person who questioned you to sort of see what they're getting at or what misunderstandings they have, then you answer. And then the questions that he totally put aside. Now the problem with the book is it's a long book. So you might want to just kind of read through the introductions to each chapter. And then if there's a particular topic you're interested, you can go into that. But as for basic concepts like karma, the 10 perfections, those kind of things, you might want to look at these study guides that are on Access to Insight, because it takes a concept and kind of carries it through as to what the Buddha had to say on that particular topic. And that can get you into the kind of the thought world. As far as the style, you have to remember that these were written to be memorized. And so there's a fair amount of repetition. Now repetition in music is fine. In ancient texts it gets kind of wearisome. But if you can remember, okay, this was meant to be chanted, this was meant to be recited aloud, cut them a little slack. That's what I recommend. Yeah.
I very much appreciate going to the texts. I mean, I enjoyed going into the suttas and just finding my own little favorite suttas. There's the Satipatthana and the Anapanasati and all of the others, but to explore the suttas and the other texts, very rich experience. Even reading the Vinaya, it's when I'm in the library here, I'll open that up and just look at it, and there's so much history in that, in terms of what the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis have to deal with. But my simple question to you is, have we translated all of the canon?
No. There's a section that's called the Apadanas, which were probably a very late addition to the canon, and there's also something called the Julanadesa and the Mahanadesa, which have not been translated at all. The Julanadesa and Mahanadesa are basically commentaries on suttas in the Sutta Nibbata. And then the Apadanas, this is the part of the canon that I really don't like. And I'll tell you why. It was written during a period when they had large monasteries, and there was a concern that they needed to make sure that people made donations to the monasteries. This was after King Ashoka. And so you read a lot of stories about so-and-so making a donation to a monastery and being guaranteed arahantship, X number of lifetimes done, and you get an idea what's going on. Now some of the stories are pretty cool, and they're kind of fun, but you have to just wade through a lot of stuff, realizing that these are monks who are trying to get donations out of people, which is why I have a creepy feeling about it. And there's a sect in Thailand right now that makes a lot of use of these, which makes it even creepier, called the Dhammakaya sect. They really, they've got this, they have what they call your housing plan for nirvana. You make a monthly donation, and you're guaranteed a plot in heaven. You make a larger donation, you're guaranteed to be a millionaire until nirvana. I mean, it's really sleazy stuff. At any rate, a couple of the stories in the Apadanas that were fun. One of my favorites is of this one man who once, in addition to just being an arahant, he wants some of the bells and whistles. And he hears this one monk being praised by a previous Buddha from many aeons past as being the monk with the nicest voice. He said, that's something I want. And so he makes the donation to that Buddha, and he makes his vow that this is what I want. And so the Buddha, that particular Buddha, confirms, yes, someday in the future will be that. You'll be that monk. And so, in one of his later lives, he gets born as a bird. And then one day he sees the Buddha of that era, and so he's so overcome with just how beautiful this Buddha is, with radiant light and everything coming out. So he plucks a mango from the tree and comes hovering up in front of the Buddha with the mango in his beak. And so the Buddha asks his attendant for the bowl, and he takes the bowl, and the bird lands on the edge of the bowl, puts the mango in the bowl, and then sings this beautiful song in favor of them. So that's how he gets the good voice. As long as you don't take this seriously, it's fun. But there's a problem here. In one of his later lives, another Buddha has passed away, and people want to build a jetty, and they don't want any limit on how tall this jetty is going to be. And so they ask the king, and the king is about to give his permission. The king has a general who says, this is going to be really wasteful. We could use all that stuff for other purposes. And so they put a limit on how tall the jetty is going to be. And so he finally gets born in the time of our Buddha, and because of his, the vow that he made and the song that he sang, he's got this really nice voice. However, because he put a limit on how tall the jetty is, he's going to be born as a dwarf. So I think that's one of the reasons why these things haven't been translated. There's a question in the back.
Thank you. So I have all these books, the middle-length discourses, the long discourses, the numerical discourses, and some ideas about how to proceed. I mean, I've read a fair amount of suttas, famous suttas, the Metta Sutta, the Satipatthana Sutta, the Anapanasati Sutta, and, lots of suttas that we hear about. And I find the study guides quite useful in access to insight. But aside from that, I find I'm not really, I feel I need some guidance about some kind of systematic way of proceeding. And I'm aware of, say, Lee Brasington has a site in which he gives some suggestions for what suttas to read, when and why, and in what order. But I feel a little bit adrift in, organizing my reading.
I'm about to put out a recommended syllabus for the Majjhima in terms of which ones to read on which topics.
So
it'll appear on Dhamma Talks.
Excuse me?
DhammaTalks.org.
Oh, and when might that be?
As soon as I get back to California.
Oh, fantastic. So,
because I just put this together for a group of my students who are going through the Majjhima right
wonderful.
now. Okay.
So how timely.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Question over here.
First of all, it's really, really cool that you came all this way. And thank you so much. It's just
It's cold here,
splendid.
yes.
Get cold. Well,
Yeah.
that's true. So the study and the practice, how do you incorporate dialogue with your buddies and in the study and practice, right? I mean, we talk about, just in this setting, we have a person up there and we
Ask questions.
Ask questions. But I've seen other settings as well where there's much less of a single defined teacher and more of like a peer thing. And I was just wondering if you had any suggestions on how we can best learn
How to run a peer
together.
group. Have somebody in the background that, okay, when you're discussing something in the group, and you can't agree on something, so okay, there's somebody we're going to go to that we trust, that we can kind of tap into. That's always good, because otherwise it's kind of the blind leading the blind through whatever. In my own case, I really didn't get involved in discussion of suttas too much until I actually came here to back to the States. And then the questions came up as to, I was telling our talk leader today that teaching the Ajahn Lee method in a world where everybody else had done Mahasi, people kept saying, what is this weird meditation you're teaching? Is that anything to do with the Buddha's teachings at all? And so I went back and I started finding passages in the canon that seemed to corroborate what Ajahn Lee was teaching. So that was my introduction to the the study as a group, talking with the other monks and trying to get things sorted out that way. There's always going to be this element that each person is going to have to finally say, okay, this is what it seems to mean to me, and then I've got to test it. And that's the best way to proceed. Yes, over here. Wait for the mic. They want to get this on tape.
You mentioned our addiction to the 5 activities the Buddha called
Khandhas.
the aggregates, clinging to them. And you mentioned the perception labeling the hunger, certain hungers. And you mentioned hunger for affection. Now, when you see this hunger for affection, in other words, or it could be as easy as someone slights you, and then you're taken aback. Well, why don't they like me? And then you look deeper, and it's a feeling like in the middle of your chest. It's a feeling of lack, that something's lacking. Why? What is it? You want people to like you because there's a lack there that needs to be filled.
Yeah, and there's a certain perception that you're holding around that I'm the person who should be appreciated.
Right.
And this is not being confirmed.
There's no reason for them not to like me, yet
Yeah,
they don't, that kind of thing.
Well, who knows? I mean, there's that famous story that Alan Wallace tells about how he was in a store one time and somebody bumped into him, and he was about to turn around and say, "What are you, blind?" He looked around, the guy really was blind.
No, but my question is that lack, where does that come from? You see it that it's there, and you think, well, why is it that? I know from the study that there's some kind of delusion there, and my mind is fabricating that.
Yeah, okay, there's a particular perception about you and how you should be treated by other people. And there's also a sense that something in there needs to be reaffirmed by your interactions with other people. There's some sense I'm really not quite right, but if somebody tells me I'm okay, I feel okay. And then if someone comes up, because you know there's both aspects to you. There's the skillful side and there's the unskillful side.
Right.
And you'd rather not look at the unskillful side. And so when someone starts treating you this way, either you start looking at the unskillful side and say, well, yeah, they're right, I really am a scum. Or else you go into denial, and this person is a total idiot. And neither way is really helpful.
And sometimes there's no basis that you can see that they wouldn't like you, and you still feel that lack. You still want them. That's based on what?
That's based on your sense, okay, I know that there's still something not quite right with my mind, and I'm looking for reassurance that I'm actually okay. And so you have to go back and say, okay, I can be at ease with the fact that there's things that are not going well in my mind, and I've got work to do. And as long as I can feel that I'm working as best I can to deal with that problem, then the problem is not that big a sore. But if you have some sense, okay, I'm not working hard enough on this, or I'm not good enough, then when someone comes in and reaffirms that idea, it hurts. And so part of it is learning how to be, I wouldn't say okay about your unskillful side, but realize, okay, here's work I've got to do, and it's okay that I'm working on it. It's better than not working on it.
Why can't you just look at it and it goes? Because you see it. There it is.
Because this is an old habit.
Because it's old karma.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, in my own case, when I was looking after John Fuang when he was sick, I was not the best nurse. I always like to think that I was really kind and compassionate, and he had his way that he wanted to be treated, and I wanted him to treat some other way. And so he was constantly, saying, "No, this is wrong. That's wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong." And I kept thinking, I can't do anything right. But then there was no one else to look after him. So I finally said to myself, and I was the kind of kid who always wanted to excel at everything. And if something I didn't excel at, I just wouldn't do. And so here was a case I had to do something that I wasn't excelling at. And I had to say, okay, I may not be the best person to do this job, but I'm the only one here. Let me live with that. And then his comments, it was easier to take his comments and learn from them. So a lot of it has to do with ego and feeding the ego. And then learning to say, okay, I can deflate my ego a little bit, and then it's not so bad. Anything else?
It's really a general question about tradition. A friend of mine just came back from Thailand. He showed me photos of temples he visited.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not about the wisdom of practice as much as it occurred to me that I don't understand why Buddha here, for example, they're all different.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Buddha, and you mentioned today's Buddha and Buddha's passing, isn't it tradition, is the Buddha a person,
Mm-hmm.
or is it a law?
There have been many Buddhas in the past, but when you see a Buddha image in Thailand, it's our Buddha, basically. And why would you want to have all the Buddhas the same?
So there are many Buddhas.
Okay, there are many Buddhas, but what you'd see in Thailand at the front of a shrine like this will be the one Buddha that we all know from Siddhartha Gautama. And it's just that there are lots of different styles. There's the different images will portray different events in his life. Like, what's this one? The hand on his knee like this. This is supposed to be calling the earth to witness right before his awakening. When Mara comes up and says, "What right do you have to be Buddha?" And the Buddha says, "Okay, have the earth goddess come and speak in my defense." And so she comes up and wrings out her hair, which is supposed to symbolize all the merit that he's created over the many eons. And this washes the forces of Mara away. This story is not in the canon, but it's a very popular story. But usually there are few places in Burma where you will see statues of previous Buddhas, but in Thailand, almost every place I've seen, it's our Buddha. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm.
I had a question following up from the question about specific things we notice coming up in our own minds during our practice. Do you have recommendations for how to find help on specific topics? Because given that the suttas are organized in the way that they are, which was meant for chanting, it can be hard to see something come up a lot, like I can't get rid of doubt when I have to make a decision, and then try to actually find skillful guidance on dealing with that problem in our own minds.
Well, this, again, if you look at some of the study guides, we'll have passages on that or related to those particular issues. I've also found teachings by Ajahn Lee and Ajahn Mahabua are very helpful in that way. Ajahn Chah, you have to be a little bit more careful because there's a lot of mistranscribed Ajahn Chah talks that then got translated into English, and there's some strange stuff that you have to be very careful about reading that. I tend to find the Force Ajahns tend to speak a little bit more directly to these kinds of issues than you find in the canon. But that's a good place to start. Question over here.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on, you mentioned about compassion, how, from what I understood, what you said, there's not some kind of innate wellspring of compassion there, like within. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay, there's an interesting passage in the canon where King Basenadi is up in his private apartment with his favorite queen. And in a moment of tenderness, he turns to her and says, "Is there anyone you love more than yourself?" Now, being a king and being a typical guy, he's he's expecting her to say, "Yes, Your Majesty, you know." But this is the Pali Canon. Come on. And so she says, "No. And how about you? Is there anybody you love more than yourself?" He says, "Well, no, not really." So that's the end of the scene. And so the king goes down to see the Buddha, and tells the Buddha what had happened. And the Buddha says, she's right. You could search the whole world over, and you would never find anyone that you would love more than yourself. And you'll find everybody else loves themselves that fiercely as you love yourself. And the conclusion he draws from that is never harm anybody. Interesting conclusion. In other words, but there's two reasons there. One is that, if you're harming other people, where's your empathy for them? The fact that they're looking for the same kind of happiness you are. And you're willing to just kind of ride roughshod over that. Are you being fair? And then the second one is, if your happiness depends on other people's misery, they're not going to stand for it. They're going to do what they can to stop it. If you want a lasting happiness, you cannot make it depend on other people's suffering. That is the beginning of compassion. And so when we see that, okay, it's in our best interest to be kind to other people, that's when we'll be kind. And when you realize, okay, if I harm anybody, it's going to come back at me, another good reason to be kind. That's where compassion comes from. And then you cultivate it by thinking about other people's suffering and other people's desire for happiness. And so you get a sense of empathy. Anything else?
Thank you. You mentioned the American Dharma, or something like that, not really existing yet. And I just wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, because I'm very new to this, and I'm finding a lot of things that I'm learning through coming here and through studying are really at odds with how I've been raised to think as an American, and especially right now, this age, like, to make something of yourself, and I'm just trying to figure out how to make things work together.
Okay, you've got two problems. One is that there's a lot of stuff in American Dharma which has nothing to do with what the Buddha taught. And so he's never saying that you should try to make something of yourself. He says you try to make yourself the best person possible. He's not down on having a healthy ego. There's an article online in Dharma Talks called "The Wisdom of the Ego." You might want to look at that. But you have to realize that when the Buddha was teaching in India, it was also not in line with Indian culture. There are a lot of things that were going against the culture. With the forest tradition, it was going against Thai culture. In America, a lot of the genuine Dharma is going to go against American culture. I'm in the midst of writing a book right now called Buddhist Romanticism, which is making the point that most of what we learn about the Dharma in the West actually has more to do with the German Romantics than it actually had to do with the Buddha. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for this. But so it's good first to check, and when you hear something in a Dharma talk, you say, wait a minute, let's double check that against some of the other more reliable sources. But there are a lot of things going on in American culture that are really kind of sick, and this is one of the good things about the Dharma, is it allows you to step back. It's okay. There's a lot of attitudes they have out there about how we should treat one another and what's really worthwhile in life, and it's good to ask, put a question mark next to them. Do I really want to get sucked into this? This way of viewing things. I mean, for me, going to Thailand was really valuable just for that purpose. Was being in another culture. Then finding myself up alone on a mountain and sort of sorting through issues from school and early adulthood and that kind of thing, and getting a different perspective on them. Go down to see a John Fuang. Sometimes he'd give me good advice, and sometimes he'd look at me as, what the hell did you get that problem? I mean, I realized, okay, this is something really, culturally American. And then coming back after 16 years and seeing that America's a really strange place. And it's you can live much more healthily in a country like that when you can step back and see it from a little bit of a distance. So if you can't get out of the country, then try to imagine yourself, okay, what in my environment am I picking up that I really don't believe in? I mean, one of the things we're lacking in our culture, which I think everybody could benefit from, is a rite of passage. When you take some time off, basically say, okay, this stuff that I've been learning ever since I was a little child, to what extent, what out of this do I want to carry into my adulthood, and which of it I'm going to just leave behind? So if you can find some way of taking some time off and asking yourself those questions, that'll help a lot. Question over here.
Just want to thank you so much for all of the writings that you've done. Thank you so much.
They're not quite 9,000, but...
Something you actually said at a different talk that really has stuck with me, and it came out of a question that someone else had asked about the difference between causing harm and causing suffering, and that it was really helpful for me to see that sometimes in saying no or setting a boundary or doing something, it will cause suffering for that person because of their own attachment.
Right.
And I really got it when you gave the talk a few years ago, and now a whole new set of life circumstances have come up that have made that very difficult for me. There's also something about the distinction between discerning between condemnation and judgment, and choosing. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit, or at least, or just point towards some literature to kind of.
Well, there's an article that I wrote called "The Power of Judgment," and there's also toward the end of the book, "With Each and Every Breath," there's a passage on the principles you use to judge a teacher, but a lot of them also have to do with how you judge a person that you can live with, or decide that you cannot live with that person. And so you might want to look at those two writings.
Okay, I'll have to listen to the recording because I just forgot what you just said.
Okay, no, it was the article is called
Sorry.
the power of judgment.
Of
The Power of Judgment.
Power of Judgment. Okay.
And then at the end of the book, "With Each and Every Breath."
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
There was another hand over there.
You talked a moment ago about rites of passage and about adulthood. And I wondered if you had a concept of when adulthood comes, when it happens, or whether it's something that can occur at any point in your life, this rite of passage.
Okay, it's basically could come at any time in your life.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good enough for me.
Yeah. Some of us never quite reach adulthood, you know. Okay, anything else? Okay, well, thank you for your attention. Okay.
By the way, if anybody in the very first row or very last row wants to help moving the cushions, that would be much appreciated.